I have always believed a room tells on its owner if you know where to look. Guests see flowers and linen and light. I watch the small things, how a chair gives underweight, whether a hinge exhales or complains, what dust dares collect in corners that should be swept by routine. It's a habit that kept Hartley House standing through winter storms that gnawed at the clapboards and through summers when the parking lot turned into a map of heat mirages. It's also the habit that saved me, though I didn't understand that on the night everything began to move. It was a Friday in late September, chilly enough that the breath of the Redwillow River showed itself when it wandered past our property. We had a rehearsal dinner in the East Conservatory, a long glass room I rebuilt pane by pane the year I turned 60, when my hands could still hold a sash window longer than a secret. Lanterns floated like patient moons over tables dressed in eucalyptus, and the bride's grandfather tuned a mandolin by a heater that ticked with its own small patience. The groom's party came in loud and well-meaning. The bride's attendants wore shawls and looked like a painting you could almost hear. Elise arrived last, the color of her coat catching every lamp as if it were courting her. She did not so much cross a room as make it reconsider its shape. There are people who know where the camera is even when there is no camera. My wife had been one of them long before influencer became a word. She kissed me on the cheek, cool and careful, an airbrushed gesture that missed warmth by a fraction. I have learned to measure fractions. You can build decks and marriages on whole inches and still lose your footing on the sliver no one noticed. You set the patio heaters, she asked, already scanning the space we had created together over 12 years, she with her sense of welcome, me with my stubborn belief that old wood deserves a second life. On low I said, winds from the mill, they'll carry. She nodded, made a small adjustment to a place card that did not need adjusting, and moved on. At the far doors, Piper was fielding a florist's apology about late peonies with the kind of kindness that ends arguments. I caught her eye, and she flashed the brief smile of a colleague who sees more than she says. The first wrong note arrived as laughter, too bright, a pitch above ordinary joy, the way glass laughs when it's about to crack. A man I didn't know had drifted from the cocktail knot and stationed himself where he could absorb Elise's attention without earning it. He wore a suit that looked leased by the hour, and a watch that had never forgotten it was meant to be seen. When she finally noticed him, her posture shifted by a degree only old husbands mark, shoulders not quite squared, chin half a coin higher. There is a grammar to betrayal, the body conjugates it before the mouth does. "Mr. Hartley," the man said when Elise brought him over, "Trent Avery. Elise has told me your restoration work borders on art." "Art is what you hang after you put the walls back," I said, and offered a hand. His grip tried too hard and failed anyway. "Trent consults for event operations," Elise added, a time-honored fiction filed under "It's easier if you don't ask." "He's helping me streamline the autumn schedule. You know how crowded October gets." I did know, and I also knew we had no room for an extra fee skimmed in the name of streamlining. But a rehearsal dinner does not want a husband's suspicion clouding the glass, so I smiled and told Trent that good systems are invisible when they work. He told me about analytics in the tone of a man who likes mirrors, and when he laughed at something Elise said, his hand found her elbow with the certainty of practice. The speeches went well, funny, a little weepy, the way hope often is when it's brave enough to stand up. I fixed a heater that coughed, refilled the sterno for the mac and cheese station the bride's mother insisted on, and dodged a ring bearer who had discovered the velocity of small shoes on tile. It would have been an ordinary night if ordinary hadn't begun to shift its meanings right under my boots. After the guests left with leftover cupcakes and promises to be on time tomorrow, I walked the length of the conservatory with a cloth in one hand and a small wrench in the other, turning off the small suns, listening to the building let go of its heat. In my office, the old butler's pantry I'd converted years ago, I sat to reconcile deposits against the week's vendor payouts. It should have been simple math. Weddings rarely are simple, but the numbers usually remember themselves. That night, the ledger looked like it had been taught a new language. The Strauss-Halpern rehearsal fee had 2 entries, one for our amount, one for a slightly smaller sum, marked Operational Consulting TA. TA, like a monogram. I opened the booking software. A new user had admin rights, E-Rowan Ops, Elise's name carrying a hyphen. It didn't need. I followed the breadcrumb to an efficiency bundle that bundled nothing except money into a column I had never authorized. The vendor list had a new line as well. Farside Holdings, Facilities Lease Adger, a description that wore a suit, smelled of cologne, and lied without blinking. My hands are not given to shaking. Even when the doctor said the word transient ischemic last winter and my left field of vision dimmed like a sconce, my tools did not rattle. But I found myself steadying the mouse with 2 fingers as if it were a bird I didn't want to spook. I printed the week's changes and slid the paper under a copy of the fire inspection, a habit as old as the house. Put the truth under something official and no one thinks to move it. When I went looking for Elise, she was in the tasting room with Trent, the door not quite closed, the kind of not quite that asks you to accept it as accident. He stood too close to her. She did not step away. Their voices were low, shaped for secrecy more than tenderness. "It has to be soon," he said, "before the next rate increase. The shell is ready, the holding company's clean, and your husband is sentimentally attached to a money pit." "He's attached to the story," she replied. "He thinks the house has a soul." "And you?" he asked. "I think souls are expensive," she said, "and stories can be rebranded. There are moments, single syllables, that take a marriage longer to say than all the years you've held it." I leaned against the cool of the hallway plaster until the building stopped pitching. Then I turned away, because a man deserves the dignity of not being watched when he finally understands the shape of his life. In the kitchen, I found Piper rewriting tomorrow's timeline with a pencil that had chewed its own eraser. She looked up, and whatever was on my face made her reach for the kettle and set it to boil without a word. "Do you ever get the feeling," I asked, "that your house is being slowly sold while you are still inside it?" "All the time," she said, "but that's because I rent." She angled her head. "You don't." I placed the printed page on the prep table and slid it toward her. She read, frowning at the math, and then mouthed far side as if it might leave a taste. "That is not a linen vendor," she said. "No," I answered, "it's a direction." We drank tea and pretended it was about the weather. When Elise came through a minute later, she was all wrists and smile again, asking whether the escort cards should be moved for tomorrow's morning light. I said they were fine where they were. She kissed my temple like a publicist, and I did not flinch, because men of my age learn to let dignity be the last thing to leave. That night, in our bedroom with its old cedar drawers and the iron bed that had listened to our best jokes, I lay awake and counted the seconds between heater clicks. Elise's breathing found its slow, practiced rhythm. Mine stayed up and walked the property, checking locks, windows, and the holes in a story I had loved because it made me better. I thought of Maya, my daughter, who had once told me that love and loyalty are cousins, who sometimes wear each other's jackets just to confuse the party. I thought of my father telling me that when wood splits along the grain, it still tells you where it wants to go. And I thought of Hartley House, of the glass room, the weight of the beams I had shouldered with friends, the vows spoken under the chandeliers we wired by hand. If a wedding venue can have a faith, it is that promises mean something. Toward dawn, a plan began to assemble itself the way fog assembles over the river, quietly, and then all at once you can't see the far bank. Plans need light, so I waited for it. When the first grey seeped through the curtains, I took my notebook from the nightstand and wrote 3 names: Nora Delgado, Ezra Bloom, Piper Quinn. Then I wrote one word I would not let go of, even if it cost me: stay. The house groaned awake. Pipes argued. A robin considered the gutter for a nest, and somewhere downstairs the ice maker cracked a joke at an empty room. Beside me, Elise turned and draped a hand across my chest with sleepy familiarity, the gesture of a woman who has measured a bed and found the person in it, obviously available. I placed my hand over hers and felt bones I knew better than my own joinery. You can love what hurts you and still decide not to let it. Another full day, she murmured. Yes, I said. Let's make it count. She smiled into the pillow. I watched the ceiling and thought about the weight a beam can take, and how men like me are taught to carry it because we can. Then I pictured the word Farside stamped on a deed that did not deserve to exist, and I knew this would be the last time my house overheard that kind of conversation in my hall. I am not a man of speeches. I am a man of doors that open when guests arrive, and doors that close when they need to. Before breakfast, I walked the perimeter of Hartley House, touching every latch and hinge, the way a father pats the pockets of a child before school, phone, wallet, lunch, checking for what matters. When I reached the conservatory, a smear on the glass caught the new sun and became a white flare. I polished it with the edge of my sleeve until the pane went clear enough to show me my own face back, older than I felt yesterday, steadier than I'd feared. Weddings ask people to say I do. I stood there and quietly said it to myself, not to Elise, not to Trent, to the rooms I had made and the people who would need them once I made this right. Then I went inside to brew coffee and to call a lawyer who has never learned to whisper. By Monday morning, the weekend weddings were behind us. The conservatory swept clean of rose petals and champagne flutes. Normally, the first day after a big event had a rhythm I could rely on. Clear the invoices, check the bookings, make sure the calendar still made sense after half a dozen last-minute changes. That rhythm is what keeps an old house alive. Stone and timber crave steadiness. But that morning, the numbers moved like they were written in water. I sat in my office, a small converted pantry with shelves lined in files, staring at the ledger. A deposit from the Fairchild Drake wedding was recorded twice, once the way it should have been, and again under a new column labeled Operational Consulting, TA. I could almost hear the sound of Trent Avery's slick handshake in those initials. I called Piper in. She arrived with her notepad tucked under her arm, a pencil stuck behind her ear. "You rang," she said, half teasing. "Tell me if I'm losing my mind." I spun the ledger around. She scanned it, frowning. "No, you're not. That's a double charge. Guests pay us, not TA. Who's TA? Trent Avery," I said quietly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Elise's new consultant." I nodded, "and apparently a partner we didn't hire." Piper folded her arms. "Do you want me to ask Elise?" "No," I said quickly. "Not yet. I want to know how far this runs before I say anything. For now, just keep your eyes open." She gave a small nod and slipped out. When she left, I pulled up the online accounts. Elise had created a second login, E-Rowan Ops, with full administrative rights. Through that account, whole slices of revenue were being siphoned into something called Farside Holdings. Every booking had a new facilities adjustment fee. A polite lie dressed in business casual. The screen blurred for a moment, not because of my eyes, but because I could feel the shape of betrayal tightening around me. Elise wasn't just moving money, she was rearranging the bones of Hartley House, and she'd brought someone else's hands into the work. I printed everything, double invoices, vendor adjustments, user logs, and slid the stack into a plain folder I marked with a carpenter's pencil. Questions. That evening, Elise breezed into the kitchen after a meeting downtown, the scent of her perfume catching the air before she did. She poured herself a glass of wine and spoke of how the town council was considering expanding tourism credits. Her smile was practiced, her tone easy, but she never asked me about the numbers, never mentioned the accounts. "Busy day?" she asked, as if nothing in our world had shifted. "Busy," I said, "and eye-opening." She clinked her glass lightly against mine, as if that counted as connection. But while she sipped her wine, I studied her face and realized she was already living in two houses, the one we had built together and another I had not been invited into. That night, after she went upstairs, I sat by the empty fireplace and leafed through the folder of printouts. Numbers don't lie. People do, and the numbers were telling me a story Elise wasn't brave enough to say out loud. For the first time since I'd laid the foundation stone at Hartley House, I felt like a tenant in my own walls. By midweek, I had memorized the name Farside Holdings the way you memorize a splinter. Small, sharp, impossible to ignore. It appeared on our booking sheets like an afterthought, a neat little line item tucked between linen rentals and bar service. But it wasn't linen, and it sure as hell wasn't bar service. It was a door left half open, and I intended to see where it led. I started where any man of my age starts, at the courthouse annex downtown, in the records department that smelled of paper dust and lemon polish. The clerks didn't ask many questions when I requested filings for Farside Holdings. They were used to tired men in flannel shirts chasing land boundaries or estate documents. What they handed me was thin, too thin. A shell corporation with a P.O. box in Portland, no listed employees, just a registered agent who'd signed a dozen other companies into existence. On the drive back, the autumn sky pressed low, clouds heavy with the promise of rain. I kept rolling the name over in my mind. Farside, it felt chosen for misdirection, as if someone wanted you to think of distance, of horizon, while they worked in your own backyard. Back at Hartley House, Piper was in the conservatory, arranging hydrangeas for the next ceremony. She caught me staring at the papers in my hand and lowered her voice. "Find anything?" "Enough to know it's nothing real," I said. "Farside doesn't rent linens, it doesn't rent anything, it exists to move money." Piper frowned. "And Elise signed off on this? Created the access herself?" The words tasted bitter in my mouth. That evening, I waited until Elise was out running errands to check her desk in the upstairs office. She had always been careful, too careful. Drawers locked, files tidy. But even careful people grow lazy when they think they own the room. Behind a folder of vendor contracts, I found a draft agreement on embossed paper. The header read, Farside Holdings, Facilities Lease Proposal. The language was slippery, all efficiency adjustments and revenue alignment, but buried halfway down was the truth. Hartley House, exclusive operations transfer, effective January 1. I read the clause 3 times before it sank in. My wife wasn't just skimming from bookings, she was preparing to sell the very roof over my head. Not to a stranger, not to a bank, but to the man with the least suit and the eager elbow touch. When Elise returned, she was glowing from whatever dinner had fed her mood. She spoke about a potential winter showcase, about lighting vendors, about how our brand could reach a new market. I listened, nodding at the right places, but every word sounded like rehearsal for a performance I hadn't been cast in. Later, when the house was quiet, I carried the draft agreement down to the kitchen and laid it flat on the oak table I had built years ago. My hands lingered on the grain of the wood. This table had seen vows planned, contracts signed, even birthday cakes cut, and now it stared up at me with the proof that my marriage had been rebranded as an exit strategy. I thought about Maya, my daughter, who used to curl up on this very table while I sanded it, chattering about stories she wanted to write one day. She'd always said truth has a way of leaking out, no matter how many coats of polish you put on it. She was right. That night, I wrote her an email I never sent, just a few lines. The house may not be ours much longer. Your stepmother has plans I wasn't told about. I'll explain when I can. I saved it in drafts, staring at the blinking cursor before closing the laptop. It was too soon to bring Maya in, too soon to let Claire or anyone know. I needed more. A man doesn't walk into battle with only a suspicion and a piece of paper. So I folded the lease agreement, tucked it under the same fire inspection report where I'd hidden the invoices, and whispered the word to myself, Farside. Not a direction, a destination, one they'd never expect me to reach first. By the next week, I knew suspicion alone would break me if I let it sit in my chest. Evidence is like wood rot. You cut it out before it spreads. I had enough papers to prove Elise was planning something, but I needed people who could turn pages into pressure, numbers into nails. That's how I ended up in the downtown office of Nora Delgado, a woman who believed in sharp lines and harder truths. Her office smelled of lemon oil and old case files. Behind her, a wall of books leaned like loyal soldiers, spines worn from years of arguments fought and won. "You're sure you want to open this door?" she asked after skimming the lease draft and invoices. I slid across the table. "Because once you do, there's no closing it without blood on the carpet, figuratively speaking. I've lived with worse," I said, "but I won't live with losing Hartley House to a shell company run by my wife's lover." Nora arched a brow, then tapped her pen. "Good. Clarity is half the battle. The other half is proof. What you've given me is strong, but courts don't run on hunches. They run on paper trails and testimony. Then we'll need someone to follow the money," I said. Which is how Ezra Bloom entered the story. Nora called him in from across the hall, a forensic accountant with ink on his cuffs and humor in his eyes. He carried a laptop that looked like it hadn't been closed in months. "Shell companies are like libraries," Ezra said after I explained Farside. "On the surface, rows of books, but most of the shelves are empty, and the titles are written in languages no one bothers to translate. My job is to find the one book that shouldn't be there, and prove who checked it out." I liked him immediately. That evening, back at Hartley House, I met Piper in the conservatory. The sun was setting, painting the glass in amber, and for a moment the whole room felt like it was holding its breath. I told her I'd hired Nora and Ezra. "Good," she said, adjusting a bouquet, "because Elise is getting bolder. Today she asked me to forward all vendor invoices to Trent directly. Said he'd streamline the process." "Did you?" "I pretended the printer jammed," Piper replied, her smile quick and sharp. I chuckled despite the weight in my chest. Piper was loyal in ways Elise had forgotten how to be. Later that night, while Elise typed away in her upstairs office, I sat at the kitchen table with Ezra's first report. Farside Holdings, it turned out, wasn't as far away as it pretended. A trail of payments led from our accounts to a downtown law firm, then back into Elise's personal trust. Not embezzlement. Not yet, but close enough to the line that she could be stripped of more than her reputation if it came to court. When I finished reading, I leaned back and stared at the glass doors of the conservatory. They reflected me, older, worn, but not finished. Not yet. The house had become a library of its own, every room holding a different chapter of betrayal. But now I had allies who knew how to read between the lines, and together we would write the ending Elise and Trent never saw coming. For all her careful secrecy, Elise must have felt the shift. Maybe it was in my eyes, or in the way I stopped letting her sign checks without looking over her shoulder. Betrayers know when the air changes, they sniff it like wolves. By Friday she made her move. It started small, an offhand remark to Piper in the conservatory. I overheard it while tightening a loose hinge on the back doors. Elise's voice was honeyed, soft enough for the staff but sharp enough for me to hear. Silas has been tired lately. Forgetful. I worry he's overexerting himself. Piper gave a neutral murmur, but when Elise left, her glance toward me said she understood exactly what had been planted. Elise wasn't just managing flowers and caterers anymore, she was cultivating a narrative. That evening over dinner she poured herself a glass of red and spoke like nothing was wrong. "You seem distracted," she said casually. "Is it the house, or is something else going on?" I studied her for a long moment. Funny. I was about to ask you the same thing. She didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, lips curving into the kind of smile that wins over committees. "Oh, Silas, you always think too much. If you'd just trust me, we wouldn't have these little shadows between us." "Trust," I said, letting the word hang. "That's a heavy thing to ask for when I've found contracts with your name on them. Contracts that hand my house to Farside Holdings." The wineglass froze halfway to her lips. Her eyes flickered just for a breath before she set it down with deliberate care. "You went through my files." "I went through our files," I corrected. "Because the bookings don't add up. Because there are invoices I never approved. Because there's a man named Trent Avery who's in my house more than I am." Her silence stretched. Then she laughed lightly, too lightly. "This is what I mean. You're imagining things. Trent is a consultant. The contracts, drafts, nothing binding. And honestly, Silas, the way you dig through papers at night, it's not healthy." She reached across the table, touching my hand with false tenderness. "You've had health scares. Strokes run in your family. Maybe it's time we admitted you're under too much strain. That's why I brought Trent in, to help, to lighten your load." There it was, the flip. In a single breath, she had turned my evidence into paranoia, my vigilance into weakness. If I pressed too hard, she would brand me unstable. And with whispers already seeded among the staff, it wouldn't take much for her story to grow. I withdrew my hand slowly. "You want me to believe I imagined all of it? I want you to rest," she said softly as if rehearsed. "Let me handle the business. You focus on your health, on Jacob, on Maya when she visits. Please, Silas, for us, for us." The words sounded like a eulogy. That night, lying awake while Elise slept soundly beside me, I realized she wasn't only preparing to sell the inn, she was preparing to sell me, a husband rebranded as an old man losing his grip, a liability, an obstacle, but she had miscalculated one thing: I had allies now. And unlike Elise, I didn't need to pretend. In the silence of the dark, I whispered to myself, "Stay steady, gather proof, let her think she's winning," because the more she believed in her story, the harder she would fall when the truth spoke louder. The first frost of October settled over Redwillow like lace, thin, delicate, but sharp enough to remind you that warmth is borrowed, never owned. Elise had been moving faster now, scheduling consultations with Trent that doubled as strategy sessions. I knew because Piper caught them lingering in the tasting room, voices lowered, a contract spread out between the champagne flutes. It was Piper who gave me the idea. She set down a centerpiece one morning, a bouquet of lilies wired tight into a copper frame, and said offhandedly, "You'd be surprised what you can hide in these." I looked up from the invoices Ezra had been tracing and felt the spark. "You mean microphones?" She raised a brow. "I meant baby's breath, but sure." By the end of the day, Nora had arranged for a discreet recorder, small enough to fit into the hollow of a stem. Piper wired it into a bouquet destined for the Redwillow Charity Gala, a black tie event Elise had insisted we attend. Elise thrived at galas. The crowd adored her poise, the way she made a room feel curated. I suspected she and Trent would use the occasion to whisper about Farside, secure enough in the noise of champagne and violins to believe no one was listening. The night of the gala, I wore the only tuxedo I owned, its shoulders stiff with years of disuse. Elise descended the staircase in emerald silk, radiant as ever, a woman whose new eyes followed her. When she glanced at me, she saw not suspicion but weariness, which suited me fine. A man underestimated is a man unguarded. At the venue, the Grand Hall of the Old Glass Library downtown, Piper met us at the entrance, playing her role as event coordinator. She carried the bouquet, handed it to Elise with a smile, and said, "For the silent auction display, something special." Elise barely acknowledged her. Trent, however, eyed the flowers with mild amusement before steering Elise toward the mezzanine. I stayed below, nursing a drink, pretending to listen to a councilman drone about zoning permits. All the while, Ezra sat in a car outside, laptop open, sound feed streaming. He texted updates in clipped sentences. 9:42 p.m. They're talking lease terms. Elise says January still target. 9:50 p.m. Trent mentions Farside, says shell is clean. 9:57 p.m. Elise, Silas is slipping. Won't fight it. Everyone believes he's tired. I gripped the glass tighter, forcing myself not to react. Let her weave the story. Let her think it airtight. Every word she spoke into those lilies was another nail in her own coffin. At 10:05, the text came through that made my breath hitch. Elise, once the papers are signed, Hartley House is ours. He'll never see it coming. Ezra followed with a simple line, "Got it. Solid evidence." When Elise and Trent finally descended, I was waiting by the coat check, my expression carved into calm stone. Elise brushed past me with her polished smile, saying, "Did you enjoy yourself?" "Immensely," I said, and I meant it. Back home, long after Elise had gone to bed, I sat in the kitchen with Nora and Ezra on speakerphone. The recording was clean, damning, and time-stamped, more than enough to challenge any claim Elise might try to make about my instability. For the first time in weeks, the knot in my chest loosened. The house still stood, the beam still held, and now, finally, the truth had a voice louder than her lies. But as Nora reminded me before we hung up, this is only the beginning, Silas. Evidence is one thing, strategy is another. Don't rush the trap. Let them walk into it. I stared at the bouquet on the table, petals already wilting, and thought about how some flowers look their best right before they fall apart. The Monday after the gala, the kitchen at Hartley House felt less like a home and more like a war room. Nora had spread documents across the oak table, Ezra's laptop hummed with spreadsheets, and Piper stood at the counter, arms folded, her expression grim but steady. I sat at the head of the table, the recording device between my hands like a relic we'd unearthed from the earth itself. "This," Nora said, tapping the recorder, "is the dagger, but a dagger alone doesn't win a trial. We need 3 pillars if we want this to stand up in court. Paper, audio, witness." She slid 3 folders toward me. "We have all 3, if we handle them right." Ezra leaned in, pointing at the first. "Paper, Farside's financials. I've traced Elise's authorizations, every invoice, every adjusted booking fee. It's not just sloppy bookkeeping, it's deliberate diversion. The money bounces through 2 shell firms before landing in a trust tied directly to Elise. That's fraud, clear as day." He opened another document, emails between Elise and Trent, pulled from an unsecured account. I skimmed a line where Trent wrote, "Once the old man's out of the way, the place is ours." I set the paper down before my grip left creases in it. The audio, Nora continued, her eyes sharp. The gala recording, Elise and Trent discussing the sale, your supposed decline, and their intent to push the deal through by January. It ties directly to the documents Ezra found. "And the witness?" I asked, though I already knew. Piper met my eyes without hesitation. "Me. I've seen the contracts, the invoices she tried to reroute, and I heard her planting seeds with staff about you being tired, unstable. I can testify to her attempts to gaslight you and cover the trail." Her voice didn't waver, though her hands tightened on the counter. Piper had no reason to risk herself for me, but she was doing it anyway. That kind of loyalty carves deeper than betrayal ever could. Nora nodded. "Good. With these 3 pillars, Elise can't just paint this as marital tension. This becomes fraud, conspiracy, and coercion. A judge won't ignore it." For a moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the tick of the grandfather clock. The plan was solid, the evidence real, but the reality was heavier than paper. This was still my wife, the woman I'd built Hartley House beside. I stared at the lilies on the windowsill, wilted now, petals curling inward. They had carried the truth when I couldn't, and the truth was colder than I'd imagined. "What happens next?" I asked. Nora gathered the folders into a neat stack. "Next we file motions, an injunction to freeze any sale or transfer of the property, a petition for discovery, so we can force her to reveal the full scope of her dealings, and if she resists, we go to court with what we have. Either way, she'll know you're not blind, and not alone." Ezra closed his laptop. She thinks she's scripting the story. What she doesn't realize is we're already writing the ending. Piper reached over and touched my arm lightly. You don't have to carry this alone anymore. For the first time, I let out the breath I'd been holding since that rehearsal dinner weeks ago. The betrayal was real, the danger was sharp, but now, finally, the ground beneath me felt solid. Elise thought she was the only narrator of this marriage, but she was about to learn that stories don't belong to liars. They belong to whoever tells them last. The morning the injunction was filed, Redwillow was still wrapped in fog, the kind that clings to the fields until noon. I stood on the porch of Hartley House with a mug of black coffee, watching the mist settle low and heavy, as if the whole town was holding its breath. Inside, the phone on the wall rang twice before Nora's voice came through, clipped and efficient. "It's done," she said. "The court granted the injunction. Any attempted transfer of ownership, lease or operational control of Hartley House is frozen until further notice. Elise cannot move a dime without judicial oversight." For a moment I didn't answer. I stared out at the gravel drive, half expecting Elise's black sedan to appear, headlights cutting through the fog. The silence stretched until Nora added, "Silas, are you hearing me? The doors are locked. She can't sell the house out from under you anymore." I let out a slow breath. "I hear you." 2 hours later, Elise came storming into the conservatory, emerald scarf flying, her face carved with fury. I'd never seen directed at me so nakedly. In her hand was the court order, the official seal glinting like a gavel already raised. "What is this?" she demanded. "You went behind my back, froze my accounts. Do you have any idea what you've done?" I set down the chair I'd been repairing and met her gaze. "I stopped you from selling my house to your lover's shell company. That's what I've done." Her mouth opened, closed, then twisted into a smile that had no warmth. "You've been talking to lawyers, dragging outsiders into our business. God, Silas, you sound unhinged. This isn't you. It's exactly me," I said evenly. "The man who built these walls by hand. The man who kept this place alive when no one else would. The man who won't be erased." For a second, I saw something flicker in her eyes, panic, maybe, or the sudden realization that her story wasn't the only one being told anymore. She dropped the papers onto the table, the pages fanning like wounded wings, and stormed out, heels striking the wood with the sharpness of retreat. Later that afternoon, the sheriff's deputy arrived. Not in sirens, not in force, just a single cruiser crunching down the drive. Deputy Klein, a steady man with kind eyes, handed me the confirmation of the court's order. He looked around the conservatory with a kind of reverence. "Beautiful place," he said. "Be ashamed to see it in the wrong hands." "It won't be," I replied. When he left, I walked the length of the house, through the tasting room, the glass conservatory, the east wing Elise had wanted to tear down for modern appeal. Every door I touched felt different, as though the wood itself had exhaled relief. That night, Elise didn't come home. I found her suitcase gone, her perfume still lingering upstairs. No note, no excuse, just absence. And strangely, that absence felt less heavy than her presence had in weeks. Piper found me in the kitchen, staring at the empty wine glass she'd left on the counter. "So, what now?" she asked. "Now," I said, sliding the glass into the sink. "We wait. She'll fight harder before she falls. But the doors are locked. She knows it, I know it, and soon everyone else will too." I looked around the kitchen, at the walls I had painted, the table I had built, the beams that had held through every storm. For the first time, they felt like they belonged to me again, not as possessions, but as proof that no matter how carefully Elise and Trent had schemed, this house had chosen to stand with me. The fog outside had lifted by nightfall. The sky was clear, sharp with stars, and I realized the air in my chest no longer carried the weight of doubt. Elise had made her play, and now, at last, so had I. The courthouse in Redwillow wasn't grand, no marble columns or sweeping staircases, just a squat brick building with windows that rattled in the wind and floors polished by decades of anxious footsteps. Yet on the morning of the hearing, as I walked up the front steps beside Nora, it felt larger than any church I'd ever set foot in. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. A handful of locals had shown up. Word travels fast in small towns, especially when the Hartley name is involved. I caught sight of Piper slipping into the back row, her notebook in hand. Ezra sat near the front with a folder so thick it could have propped open the heavy oak doors. Elise arrived late, dressed in navy silk and defiance. Trent hovered at her side in his ever-gleaming watch, projecting confidence but failing to mask the tension in his jaw. They took their seats as though they owned the air itself. The judge, a grey-haired woman named Harlan, called the session to order. Nora stood first, her voice cutting clean through the hush. Your Honor, we are here to address fraudulent activities conducted under the guise of Farside Holdings. We will demonstrate that Mrs. Rowan Hartley and her associate, Mr. Avery, conspired to divert funds and unlawfully transfer control of Hartley House. She laid the first folder on the bench. The paper trail, she said, bank records, invoices, wire transfers, all leading back to the defendants. Ezra was sworn in as the first witness. He explained, step by step, how funds had been siphoned from our bookings, rerouted through shells, and returned into Elise's trust. He spoke plainly, his quiet humor absent, leaving only the weight of facts. Trent shifted in his seat, his hand tightening on his tie. Next came the audio. Nora pressed play, and the room filled with Elise's voice, clear as bells under crystal chandeliers. Once the papers are signed, Hartley House is ours. He'll never see it coming. The words hung heavy. Elise's face didn't move, but the crowd rippled with gasps. The judge's brow lifted, just enough to speak volumes. Finally, Piper was called. She stepped forward, hands steady, eyes sharp. She told the court about invoices. Elise asked her to reroute, about the whispers of my supposed decline, about how Elise had tried to seed doubt in staff about my stability. Mr. Hartley is not unstable, Piper said firmly. He is meticulous. The only instability came from the lies meant to silence him. When it was Elise's turn, she rose with a practiced sorrow. Your Honor, my husband has been under great stress. His health has declined. His memory is not what it once was. These so-called schemes are nothing more than drafts and proposals he misunderstood. Trent was helping me prepare for transitions should Silas be unable to manage the inn. She turned, her eyes meeting mine with the weight of 20 years. I was trying to protect what we built, even if he refuses to see it. For a heartbeat, the room was still. Then Nora rose, her voice sharp as broken glass. Mrs. Rowan Hartley, are you denying this is your voice on the recording? Elise faltered, just a flicker, then found her footing again. I don't recall the context. Context, Nora interrupted, does not change the words, or the intent. Judge Harlan raised a hand. That's enough. I've heard enough for today. She looked between Elise and Trent, her gaze as cold as riverstone. This court recognizes sufficient cause to extend the injunction indefinitely. Further, given the evidence presented, I am ordering a full audit of Farside Holdings and any connected accounts. Until this is resolved, Hartley House remains under Mr. Hartley's sole control. The gavel came down like thunder. Elise stiffened, her mask cracking just enough to show the fury beneath. Trent whispered something in her ear, but his confidence was leaking like a cut tire. I stood slowly, my hand brushing the edge of the table I hadn't built, but had claimed nonetheless. The vows spoken here were not of love or loyalty, they were of law, binding in their own way. Elise had broken the first vows we ever shared. Now the courtroom had written new ones in ink she couldn't erase. As I walked out into the crisp autumn air, Piper fell into step beside me. She's cornered, she said. Not enough yet, I replied. Cornered animals fight hardest. But even as I said it, I felt the house behind me, Hartley House, standing taller, its foundation steady. For the first time, Elise and Trent had been forced to speak their betrayal out loud. And once spoken, words like that don't vanish. The first hard frost of November coated the vineyards like spilled sugar. By then, Elise had moved into Trent's townhouse on the edge of Portland, and Hartley House stood quiet, waiting. The court audit was underway, Ezra supplying ledgers and explanations, Nora sharpening each filing into a blade. Every day the evidence grew heavier, and every day Elise's footing slipped further. The downfall arrived faster than even I expected. Farside Holdings, once a sleek name on letterhead, unraveled under scrutiny. Hidden accounts, falsified invoices, payments funneled through Trent's consulting firm. It was all there, tangled threads pulled into daylight. The state opened a fraud investigation. Trent's face, once smug and polished, now carried the grey pallor of a man who knew subpoenas came next. I didn't hear it from Elise. She stopped calling, stopped trying to spin her story. I heard it from Nora, her voice brisk over the phone. They're finished. The court will freeze their personal assets by next week. Trent will face charges. Elise will too, if she doesn't cut a deal. Either way, Hartley House is safe. Safe. The word landed like a prayer. That weekend, a wedding took place in the East Conservatory. Piper coordinated, her hands deft as ever, arranging eucalyptus and candles with quiet grace. Guests filled the glass room, their laughter echoing beneath the chandeliers I had wired with my own hands. For the first time in months, the place felt alive again, untouched by betrayal, humming with promise. When the bride and groom raised their glasses for the final toast, I lingered at the back, unnoticed, watching the light catch on crystal. Their vows, spoken hours earlier, still seemed to hang in the air, for better, for worse. Words I once believed Elise and I had meant. Words she had traded for a scheme. Piper found me as the guests danced. She handed me a glass of champagne, her smile soft. "You should toast too, Silas. This house deserves it." I looked at the glass, then at the room I had built piece by piece, the oak beams, the polished floors, the glass walls that held both joy and sorrow. I raised the glass, not high, not for show, just enough to meet the house itself. "To survival," I whispered, "to truth that doesn't bend. To Hartley House." Piper clinked her glass gently against mine. "And to new beginnings," she added. We drank, and in that moment, the weight of betrayal slipped off me like an old coat I no longer needed. Elise and Trent would spend their days in courtrooms and auditors' offices, answering for lies they thought too clever to catch. Their empire of deceit had crumbled, brick by brick, under the weight of their own arrogance. As the music swelled and the bride's laughter rang out, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: peace. Not triumph, not vengeance, just the quiet certainty that the story was mine again. Hartley House would stand, I would stand, and the last toast, though unseen, belonged to me.